On the dimly lit subway platform, a homeless boy stood, his clothes ragged, his face covered in grime. His eyes, though empty, had a certain fire, a desperate kind of hope. The harsh city noise clanged in his ears, but his mind was quiet, focused on the man standing in front of him. This man, middle-aged, well-dressed, his eyes tired, yet unwavering, hadn't even noticed the boy approaching. He looked like he had everything, the job, the house, the family, everything anyone could want. Yet here, in the grime of the subway, he was about to receive an unexpected request. "Can you give me $1?" The boy's voice was quiet, barely audible over the passing trains. He didn't know, but this was Keanu Reeves. The words hung in the air, small, almost fragile, as if they might break if spoken louder. The boy's request wasn't just for $1. No, it was an unspoken plea, a cry from the depths of his soul. The man blinked, his posture stiffened slightly, a brief flicker of something in his eyes. Was it judgment? Or perhaps pity? The boy could hardly tell. For a moment, the man just stood there, surveying him like he had seen this same image too many times before. The beggar, the lost soul, the one who had given up. But then something in the boy's eyes broke through. Perhaps it was the vulnerability, the sheer honesty of the request, or perhaps it was the way the boy held himself. His posture was broken, but there was a strange dignity in the way he stood. It was clear he had not always been this way, that life had forced him into this existence. Something about the boy's eyes reminded the man of someone he once knew, someone he loved dearly, someone who had hurt him in ways he never thought possible. "Why should I give you $1?" the man finally asked, his voice cold, calculating. He was trying to control the situation, to maintain the upper hand. There was no sympathy in his tone, just a detached indifference. The boy looked down at the ground for a moment, his fingers twitching with something like nervousness, before he looked back up. The world around him blurred, and in that moment, he wasn't asking for $1 anymore. No, it was something much deeper, something that had been buried for years, a longing for connection, for validation. "I don't want to be like this," the boy said, his voice shaking slightly, barely more than a whisper. I used to be someone. But I don't know where I went wrong." The man's face softened, just a fraction, but it was enough. He hesitated, the memory of his own long-forgotten pain resurfacing for the briefest moment. He had once been young, full of hope, filled with the same fire the boy had now. But life, betrayal, and time had dulled that fire. What had happened to him? What had he become? He had everything, but in the hollow chambers of his chest, he felt nothing. Just emptiness. "Tell me your story," the man said, his voice low, almost apologetic. For a moment, he almost saw himself in the boy, reminded of the pain of his own past, of the betrayals that had shaped him into the man he had become. The boy sat down on the edge of the platform, his legs folded beneath him as if to shield himself from the world. "I used to have a family," the boy started, his voice distant as if he were remembering another lifetime. "I had parents who loved me. A sister, too, we were happy once." His hands shook, clenching into fists. But things changed. "My dad, he lost his job, and my mom, she got sick. Really sick. I couldn't watch her suffer, and it broke me. But my father, he left. He didn't even look back. He abandoned us when we needed him most." His voice cracked. The man's brow furrowed, and for a moment, he found himself unable to speak. He had heard similar stories, but hearing the raw pain in this boy's voice, he couldn't help but feel the sting of it. "They both died," the boy continued, his voice hollow now. "And when they were gone, I had no one. I lost everything. I didn't know how to fight for myself anymore, and I ended up here." He gestured weakly around him. "Alone. The man looked away, feeling uncomfortable, the weight of the boy's words pressing against his chest. He was reminded of his own father, who had been absent for most of his life, only to return when the man was older, expecting forgiveness. But the hurt of abandonment could never be so easily erased. "That's why I ask," the boy said, his gaze distant, almost hopeful. $1. Maybe it'll help me feel human again. Maybe it'll help me feel like I matter." The man swallowed, feeling a knot in his throat. It was a ridiculous request, just $1. But what the boy had said, the weight of his words, it struck him harder than he would have liked to admit. He realized that the boy wasn't asking for money at all. He was asking for dignity. He was asking to be seen, to be acknowledged. For a brief moment, the man stood in silence, his fingers twitching at his side, as if unsure whether to help or turn away. The boy's gaze never wavered, full of desperation, but also, somehow, pride. Then, without a word, the man reached into his pocket. For a moment, he considered walking away, but instead, he pulled out a crumpled dollar bill and handed it to the boy. "Here," he said, his voice softer now, "take it. But, don't ever forget who you are." The boy looked at the dollar in his hand, his eyes welling up with tears that he refused to let fall. "Thank you," he whispered, barely audible. The man turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the subway. But as he walked, he felt a strange weight lift off his shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't just walking through life. He was aware. Aware of the person he had become. The man walked briskly through the subway tunnel, but his mind was anything but focused. The echo of the boy's voice, that quiet plea, still resonated within him. He tried to shake it off, as if it were just another fleeting moment, something he could easily forget. But it wouldn't leave. The more he tried to push it away, the more it consumed him. He thought about the dollar he had given. It was only $1. It should have meant nothing. Yet the weight of it seemed to anchor itself in his chest. Why had he done it? It wasn't like him to feel pity for anyone, let alone a stranger. His life had taught him that kindness only made you weak, that trust was something you had to earn by wielding power. People like the boy were the ones who always ended up at the bottom, never making it out. But then, why couldn't he stop thinking about the boy's eyes? When he arrived at his apartment, he tossed his briefcase on the sofa, his shoes kicking off in frustration. His wife was already home, sitting at the kitchen table, her face buried in a stack of papers, but she looked up when she heard him enter. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice high and practiced, a thin layer of politeness masking her true feelings. He could tell she was exhausted, and yet, she still tried to keep up the appearance of the perfect wife. "Fine," he muttered, rubbing his temples. He wasn't interested in talking about his day. He wasn't even sure what had happened anymore. His mind kept replaying that boy's face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice softening, her eyes narrowing in on his troubled expression. He snapped his gaze back to her, irritated. "Nothing. Just tired." She didn't push, but he could see the hurt in her eyes, the way she flinched at his tone. She had grown accustomed to his coldness, but it still stung. She had always been good to him, hadn't she? Always there, always supportive. She'd stuck by his side when things got rough, when he had no money, when he lost his job. She had believed in him when he no longer believed in himself. But somewhere along the way, he had grown distant, detached, uninterested. And when he had found her, the woman who was everything she wasn't, it was like a door had opened, a way out from the life that had started to feel suffocating. He had found someone who validated his weaknesses, who told him everything he wanted to hear, someone who didn't make him feel responsible. He was ashamed of himself, but not enough to stop. The shame was fleeting, the addiction to his affair, to the escape it gave him, was stronger. Can we talk? She asked again, breaking through his haze. Her eyes were searching his face, as if she could see the cracks he was desperately trying to hide. He nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. There was so much he wanted to tell her, but nothing seemed right. How could he tell her the truth when the truth made him sick? How could he explain to her that he no longer loved her, that he hadn't loved her for a long time, even though she was still the same kind, caring woman who had stood by his side for years? "I'm sorry," he muttered, his words barely audible. "I've been distant. I don't know how to fix this." She looked at him, her brow furrowing as if she didn't understand. "Fix what?" He opened his mouth to speak, but the words got caught in his throat. The weight of everything, his betrayal, his coldness, his guilt, was suddenly too much to bear. He wanted to tell her about the affair, about the feelings he had suppressed, about how he felt trapped in a life that no longer fit him. But instead, he just stood there, paralyzed by his own failure. "Why did you give him the dollar?" she asked softly, catching him off guard. She had been quiet for a while, but now her voice was filled with curiosity. He froze, a sick feeling curling in his stomach. "What?" He didn't remember mentioning the boy to her. "I saw you," she continued, her voice calm, but there was a flicker of something darker in her eyes. "On your way home. You gave him money, didn't you?" His first instinct was to deny it, to brush it off as nothing, but the guilt in his chest made his words stick. He couldn't lie, not to her, not now. "Yes," he muttered, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I gave him $1." She was silent for a moment, but he could feel her eyes on him, piercing, searching. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice softer, almost incredulous. "You don't help people. You don't care about anyone but yourself. What changed?" Her words cut through him like a knife. He wanted to snap at her, to tell her that she didn't understand, that she had no idea what he had been through, that she had no idea how he was suffocating under the weight of his own lies. But instead, he was silent, struggling to breathe under the pressure of his own reflection. "I don't know," he whispered, barely audible. "Maybe I just felt sorry for him. Or maybe I saw myself in him." Her expression softened, but there was no sympathy in her eyes. There was only disappointment. "You're not the man I married anymore," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know who you are, but I don't think I love him." He flinched as if she had slapped him, but the words rang true. She was right. She didn't know him anymore, and he didn't know himself. And just like that, the moment was over. She turned away from him, her face hardening, her eyes shutting down. "Good night," she whispered, retreating into the silence of their apartment, leaving him standing there, lost in his own mess. The boy's face flashed in his mind again. What had happened to him? Had he really been abandoned in the same way he had abandoned his wife? Was he, too, struggling to survive? Or had he already given up? The thought unsettled him more than he would admit. The man walked to the window and looked out into the night, his reflection staring back at him with a look of shame that no amount of money, power, or success could erase. And deep inside, he knew something he couldn't ignore any longer. He had become the very thing he despised. The days that followed felt like an endless stretch of tension, each one heavier than the last. His wife's words lingered in the air, a constant reminder of his failures. Every time he tried to escape them, they followed him, haunting him in the quiet moments, creeping into his thoughts even when he tried to focus on something else. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was slipping through his fingers, and the more he tried to control it, the more everything seemed to unravel. He didn't go back to the subway. The boy's face, the plea for $1, had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The guilt gnawed at him, sharp and relentless, but he buried it, focusing instead on the routine he had built to keep his mind from spiraling. He kept telling himself that he was fine, that nothing had changed. But inside, he was far from fine. At work, he threw himself into his tasks with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He pushed aside any personal concerns, determined to bury the feelings he didn't want to face. The affair continued, though now it felt different. The excitement had faded, replaced by a sense of emptiness that only grew with each passing day. He found himself resenting the woman who had once been the escape he so desperately needed. She had become just another part of the facade he had built to cover up the cracks in his life. One evening, after a long day at the office, he found himself walking through the streets aimlessly, trying to outrun the weight of his choices. He passed familiar shops, empty restaurants, and darkened alleys, all of them blurring together in a haze. The city felt colder than usual, the air thick with an unspoken tension that mirrored the turmoil inside him. And then, there it was again, the boy. He was standing by the entrance of a convenience store, shivering in the cold, his face gaunt and tired, but those eyes, those damn eyes, were the same. He recognized him instantly. It was as if the boy had never left his mind, as if he had been waiting for him all this time. He stopped in his tracks, heart pounding. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, as if time itself was holding its breath. The boy looked at him, and their eyes locked. There was no plea this time, no desperate cry for help. Instead, there was something else, something far more unsettling. The boy's gaze held an unspoken understanding, as if he knew exactly who this man was, what he had done, and what he was running from. "Hey," the boy said, his voice quieter than before, but no less cutting. "You remember me, don't you?" He swallowed hard, unable to speak. The boy was standing there, in front of him, a stark reminder of everything he had tried to forget. He thought about walking away, about turning his back and pretending like he had never seen him. But he couldn't. The boy had become a symbol of everything he had failed to acknowledge in himself. "Why are you here?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The boy shrugged, his expression hard to read. "Same reason as always," he replied, his voice filled with a mixture of bitterness and resignation. Surviving. The word hit him like a punch to the gut. Surviving. That was all anyone ever did, wasn't it? He had spent so long trying to survive, to keep up with the lies and the deceit, that he had forgotten what it meant to live. He looked at the boy, really looked at him for the first time. The years of pain, the suffering that had carved lines into his face, the hunger in his eyes, everything that he had ignored, that he had pushed aside, was right there in front of him. The boy wasn't just asking for $1 anymore. He was asking for something far deeper, something far more profound. And then, the realization hit him. The boy had already lost everything. He had been abandoned, neglected, rejected by the very people who were supposed to care for him. But somehow, he had kept going. Somehow, he had found the strength to survive. The man felt a lump form in his throat. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He had nothing to say, nothing that could undo the years of his own neglect, the years he had spent running away from the truth. "You're right," the man finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been running, haven't I?" The boy didn't respond, but his eyes softened, just a little. "You're not the only one," the boy said, and for the first time, there was a hint of empathy in his voice. "We all have our demons. But we don't have to let them win." The man's chest tightened. It was as if the boy had taken the words right out of his mouth, exposing the truth he had been too afraid to confront. He had let his demons win. He had let them dictate his actions, control his life, and in doing so, he had lost everything that truly mattered. His wife, the woman who had loved him unconditionally, was still waiting for him to come back. She was still holding on, still hoping that he would see the light. But he had to make a choice. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. The boy's words echoed in his mind as he stood there, facing the cold reality of his own choices. It was time to stop running. It was time to stop hiding. But it wasn't just about him. It was about the people he had hurt along the way. His wife, the one person who had stood by him when no one else would. He had betrayed her, lied to her, and left her to suffer alone. But he couldn't undo the past. He could only choose what came next. "Do you need help?" he asked, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. The boy didn't answer right away. He simply looked at the man, studying him with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. "I'm not asking for charity," the boy said finally. "I'm asking for respect." The words hit him like a wave. Respect. It wasn't something he had ever truly understood. He had demanded it, had expected it, but he had never given it. Not to anyone, least of all himself. "I can do that," he said quietly, his voice steady for the first time in what felt like forever. The boy gave a small nod, as if he had already known what the man was going to say. "You don't have to fix everything. Just start by fixing yourself." With that, the boy turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the street. The man stood there for a long time, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had just realized. The boy had given him the one thing he had been searching for, a glimpse of redemption, of the possibility that he could still change. But it wouldn't be easy. And it wouldn't be quick. The man knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had faced his demons, and now, he was ready to face himself. The days after the encounter with the boy blurred together, each moment a reminder of the internal battle raging inside the man. He had finally stopped running, but the weight of his choices pressed down on him harder than ever. He couldn't escape the haunting memories of how he had treated his wife, how he had abandoned her when she needed him the most. The shame consumed him, threatening to swallow him whole. Every time he tried to move forward, he was dragged back by the past, by the consequences of his own actions. His wife's condition had worsened. He had been receiving updates from her doctors, but he hadn't dared to visit. He hadn't known how to face her, how to look into her eyes knowing the pain he had caused. But the guilt was becoming unbearable. Every phone call, every text, every moment of silence felt like a lash against his soul. He had turned his back on her, but in doing so, he had turned his back on everything he had ever cared about. Then came the day that changed everything. He was sitting in his office, scrolling through emails, when his phone buzzed with an alert. It was a message from his wife's doctor. "She's asking for you. She needs you." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He dropped the phone in shock, his hands shaking. He had been expecting this moment, had known it was coming, but he wasn't prepared for the overwhelming flood of emotions that swept over him. Fear, regret, guilt, they all collided in a whirlwind inside his chest. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and walked to the door. His heart raced, his breath shallow. He had to see her. He had to make things right. He couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. But deep down, he feared it was too late. When he arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant hit him immediately. The halls felt cold, the air thick with an eerie silence. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor as he made his way to her room. Each step felt like a weight on his shoulders, each breath harder to take than the last. When he entered the room, he saw her lying there, so fragile, so small in that sterile bed. She looked up at him with a faint smile, but there was no joy in her eyes, only the hollow emptiness of someone who had been abandoned. Her face was pale, her hair thin and brittle from the treatments. She looked nothing like the woman he had once known, and the sight broke him. "Do you remember me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. His throat tightened, and he fought the tears that threatened to spill. He wanted to answer her, to tell her how sorry he was, but the words wouldn't come. He had no right to say anything. "I'm so sorry," he finally choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I was thinking. I've been a coward." She shook her head, her hand reaching out to him, but it wasn't for comfort. It was as if she was trying to push him away. "It's too late for apologies," she said softly, her voice filled with a sadness that cut through him like a knife. "You made your choice. And now I have to live with it." The words stung, each one like a shard of glass cutting through the layers of his heart. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't understand how everything had gotten so twisted, so wrong. He had thought that he could fix things, that he could redeem himself, but it felt like the moment had passed. She had moved on, and now he was the one left behind. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, his voice trembling. "I was scared. I was so scared of losing you, of everything." Her eyes flickered with a mix of sorrow and pity. "You weren't scared of losing me," she said quietly. "You were scared of facing yourself." The words hit him with the force of a punch. He had spent so long running from the truth, from the pain, that he had failed to see what was right in front of him. He hadn't been afraid of losing her. He had been afraid of the consequences of his own actions, of the guilt, of the shame. He had been too weak to face the reality of what he had done. For the first time, he understood the true depth of his failure. He had abandoned her, yes, but in doing so, he had abandoned himself as well. He had let fear control him, had let his own insecurities define his choices. And now, he was paying the price. He sat down beside her, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to fix this." She reached out, her frail hand touching his arm. It was a gesture so small, yet so powerful. "You can't fix it," she said softly. "But you can learn from it. You can let it change you." The words were like a lifeline, a small glimmer of hope in the darkness. He didn't know how, or even if, he could change. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted to try. "I've been so selfish," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've hurt you, and I can't take that back. But I'll never stop trying to make things right." She gave him a faint smile, the kind that was filled with sorrow, but also with understanding. "You can't change the past," she said gently. "But you can change who you are moving forward." And just like that, in the quiet of the hospital room, something inside him shifted. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know if he could ever fully make up for the pain he had caused. But for the first time in years, he felt the stirring of something powerful inside him, something that felt like hope. The next few days were a blur. He visited her every day, though their conversations were few and far between. He could see the toll that her illness had taken on her, but he could also see the strength she still held inside her. She was a fighter, even in the face of unimaginable pain. And he was determined to fight, too. But just as things seemed to be moving in a direction of healing, the unthinkable happened. She passed away quietly in the night, with no one by her side. She had always wanted to be with him when she went, but in the end, it was her strength that saw her through to the other side. He had never imagined that this would be the end of their story. But it was. And as he stood over her grave, his heart heavy with sorrow and regret, he made a promise to himself. He would never let fear control him again. He would never let guilt define him. And he would never forget the lessons she had taught him, the lessons of love, strength, and redemption. As he left the cemetery, the weight of his sorrow still heavy on his chest, he finally understood what he needed to do. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about learning to live with it. And in doing so, he would find the strength to move forward. For the first time, he was ready to face whatever came next. The weeks that followed her passing were nothing but an endless blur of grief and self-reflection. Every night, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. He had spent so much time running from his own demons, from the fear of facing his mistakes, but now, they had caught up to him. And it was far worse than he had ever imagined. In the quiet of the empty house, he found himself haunted by memories of her, the way she used to smile, the softness of her touch, the way her laughter used to fill the rooms. Now, the house was just a shell, an empty reminder of what he had lost. It was as though he had traded everything that had mattered for fleeting moments of selfish pleasure, and in the end, all he was left with was the hollow echo of regret. Every day, he fought the urge to drown in that regret. He had no one to turn to, no one to confide in. His friends had abandoned him long ago, too disgusted by his actions to offer comfort. And his family, well, they had always been distant, never really understanding him. Now, they all seemed to watch from afar, judging him in the same way he had judged himself. One night, as he walked down the empty streets, the weight of his isolation finally hit him. He had pushed everyone away, abandoned the woman who had loved him, and in doing so, he had destroyed the very core of who he was. He was a shell of a man, broken, lost, and unrecognizable to even himself. He stopped at a bus stop, staring blankly at the ground, when a voice broke through the silence. It was a soft voice, hesitant, almost as if it were afraid of disturbing the stillness of the night. "Hey," the voice said. "Are you okay?" He looked up, startled. There, standing before him, was the homeless boy from the metro station, the boy he had ignored, the one he had brushed off in his moment of arrogance and self-absorption. The boy was different now, though. His clothes were tattered and worn, his face even more gaunt than before. But there was something in his eyes, something deep, something knowing, that caught him off guard. It was as if the boy could see straight through him, past all the masks he had put up to protect himself. For a moment, the man didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at the boy, feeling a strange connection that he couldn't explain. The boy had been the one to ask for $1 that day, but now, he was the one offering something far more valuable, compassion. "Why do you care?" the man finally asked, his voice raw and broken. "I don't deserve it." The boy shrugged, his gaze steady. "Everyone deserves a little kindness," he said simply. "Even you." The words hit the man harder than he expected. He had spent so much time drowning in his guilt, in his shame, that he had forgotten what it felt like to receive kindness, to be seen for who he was, not for the mistakes he had made, but for the person he still could be. "I've done terrible things," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. "I abandoned her. I was supposed to be there for her, and I wasn't." The boy nodded, his expression soft but knowing. "You're not a bad person because you made mistakes. You're just a person, like everyone else. You can still change. You can still make things right." The words resonated within him like a melody he hadn't heard in years. He had been so focused on the weight of his mistakes, so consumed by the belief that he was beyond redemption, that he had forgotten the most important truth of all: it wasn't too late. For the first time, the man didn't feel so alone. The boy, a stranger just days ago, had become a lifeline, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was still a way forward. "I don't know how to fix everything," the man admitted, his voice quivering. "I don't know how to make up for the pain I caused." The boy's smile was gentle, almost sad. "You don't have to fix everything. You just have to start with yourself. One step at a time." The man didn't know what compelled him, but he suddenly found himself asking, "How do I start?" The boy stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You start by forgiving yourself. You can't change the past, but you can learn from it. You can choose to be better, to be the person you want to be." And most importantly, you can choose to love yourself, even when you don't think you deserve it. For the first time in what felt like forever, the man let himself feel something other than guilt. A spark of hope, fragile, but present, flickered inside him. Maybe he wasn't beyond saving after all. Maybe there was still a chance for him to find peace, to make amends, to forgive himself and start anew. But the boy wasn't done yet. He stepped back slightly, looking the man in the eye. "I have a secret for you," he said quietly. "There's a way to make all of this go away. There's a way to rebuild your life, to become the person you were always meant to be." The man's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. The boy leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's a power inside of you. You just have to learn how to unlock it. It's a secret that no one talks about, something men like you don't know, something that can change everything for you." The man felt a rush of curiosity. The boy's words were cryptic, but there was an undeniable truth in them, something that stirred deep within him. He wanted to know more. He wanted to believe that there was a way out of this pain, a way to finally break free from the chains of his past. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man confessed, his heart pounding in his chest. "But I want to learn. I want to change." The boy's smile was small but genuine. "You'll find it," he said simply. "But you have to be willing to open yourself up to it. You have to stop running from who you are and start facing it. The rest will follow." And with that, the boy turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had appeared. The man stood there, his mind racing, his heart filled with a mix of fear and anticipation. What was this secret? What could it mean for him? And, most importantly, could he finally, truly, start over? As he stood alone in the dark, the answers weren't clear, but one thing was, the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. But it was one he was finally ready to take. For the first time in years, the man felt a spark of something that had been missing for so long, hope. And with it, the possibility of a future he never thought he could have. The boy's words echoed in his mind as he walked home, his steps lighter than they had been in months. Start with yourself. And so he would. The days that followed the encounter with the boy felt like an overwhelming blur of hope and confusion. The man couldn't shake the boy's words from his mind, couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious secret he had hinted at. It was a feeling he hadn't had in years, the sensation of something just out of reach, like a dream he was desperately trying to grab but kept slipping away. But there was something powerful in it. Something that made his heart beat a little faster and his thoughts raced a little more urgently. Every time he closed his eyes, the words echoed louder, "Start with yourself." What did it mean? How could he even begin? How could he fix what he had broken? He thought back to the wreckage of his life, the ruins of relationships, the shattered trust, the woman he had loved, the promises he had broken. There were nights when the weight of it all was too much to bear. He would stare at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, hating what he saw, a man who had failed, a man who had become nothing more than a ghost in his own life. But there was something about those words, something that made him want to try, just once more, to claw his way out of the pit he had dug for himself. He started small, simple things at first. He tried to go to the gym, though the feeling of being surrounded by people made him want to crawl into a hole and hide. He forced himself to make eye contact with strangers, to smile, to be present. Each small step felt like a monumental victory, but also an exhausting reminder of how far he had fallen. One evening, as he walked home, he passed the same bus stop where he had met the boy. His gaze swept over the empty street, the familiar silence pressing in on him like a suffocating weight. But then, as if by some strange twist of fate, he saw someone standing at the corner of the block. It was a woman, a stranger, but something about her seemed familiar. She was standing near the alleyway, as if waiting for someone, and as the man walked closer, he realized with a jolt that it was her, the woman he had once loved. His breath caught in his chest. He hadn't seen her since that day, the day everything had shattered into irreparable pieces. He had left her behind, just as he had left everything else behind. But now she was here, standing in front of him, looking just as beautiful as the day he'd last seen her. She looked different, of course, older, maybe, but there was still a spark in her eyes that sent a rush of memories flooding back. He stopped in his tracks, unsure of what to do. The old feelings of guilt, regret, and longing surged within him, overwhelming everything else. He couldn't let her go. Not like this. Not after everything he had done. "Hey," he said, his voice cracking slightly. She turned, and for a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. It was as if time had stopped, and the world had disappeared around them. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but nothing came out at first. Her eyes were wide, as if she couldn't believe he was standing there, right in front of her. You're still alive?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling. I thought you'd disappeared forever." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She had thought he was gone. She had thought he had just vanished from her life without a trace. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I know I don't deserve to say this, but I'm so sorry. For everything." Her face softened for a split second, but the hardness returned quickly. She shook her head, as though trying to shake off a memory that refused to leave her. "You don't get to apologize for that," she said, her voice sharp. "You broke everything. You broke me. And I don't think there's anything left to fix." Her words cut through him like a knife. He had heard them before, countless times in his mind. He knew he had failed her. But hearing them from her, from the person he had once cared about more than anything, made the pain feel more real, more unbearable. He wanted to reach out to her, to say something, anything, to make her understand how deeply he regretted what he had done. But the words got stuck in his throat, trapped by the weight of his own shame. She took a step back, her eyes full of tears. "I've moved on. I have to move on. You don't get to come back into my life and expect everything to be okay." The finality in her voice was like a death sentence. He had known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. It felt like his heart was being torn from his chest, and the raw pain was almost too much to bear. "I don't want things to be okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I just want a chance to make it right. If I can, I will. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for everything I've done." But she didn't answer. She just turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving him standing there, feeling more lost and empty than he had ever felt before. He collapsed onto the curb, his body shaking with the force of his sobs. It felt like he was drowning in regret, suffocating in his own mistakes. There was no easy way out of this, no quick fix. He had to live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. But then, as if from nowhere, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. The boy's words came rushing back, "You can still change. You can still make things right." The man wiped his eyes and stood up, his legs trembling beneath him. He didn't know what the future held, or whether he could ever truly make up for what he had done. But he knew one thing for certain: he was going to try. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than pain. He felt the barest glimmer of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way back from the edge of his own destruction. And he was going to take that hope, even if it was the only thing he had left. He was going to keep moving forward. The following days were a blur of turmoil and revelation. The man found himself caught in a storm of emotions, battling the ghosts of his past while trying to figure out what to do with the fragile hope he had unearthed within himself. He wandered through life in a haze, his every move haunted by the woman he had lost, the mistakes he could never erase. But amidst it all, he had come to one stark realization: he could not change the past. He couldn't undo the hurt, couldn't fix the irreparable damage he had caused. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could build something new, something better. The morning light was weak as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at a half-empty cup of coffee. The silence in his apartment was suffocating, and every second that ticked by seemed to mock him, reminding him that the choices he had made had led him to this lonely place. But now, there was something more pressing than his despair, a sense of urgency that gnawed at him. He had to keep moving forward. The pain was unbearable, but he couldn't let it consume him. A few days later, as he walked through the city streets, trying to clear his mind, he saw the boy again, the one he had met at the metro. The boy was standing near the same corner, his face a mix of hope and hesitation as he glanced at the people passing by. The man's heart clenched, and before he could stop himself, he approached him. "You," the boy said quietly, recognizing him immediately. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but also something else, something deeper, as if the boy had been waiting for him. "I've been thinking about you," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you said to me, it got to me. It really did." The boy tilted his head slightly, as if curious but not entirely convinced. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. His words were simple, but the weight they carried was immense. It was a question the man had been grappling with for days. He didn't know the answer, but he knew he had to try. The man took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm going to change. I'm going to make things right, not for anyone else, but for me. I'm going to start by fixing the damage I've done, and if I can, I'll keep going from there." The boy studied him for a moment, then nodded, as if satisfied with the response. "Good," he said simply. "But it's not just about fixing what's broken. It's about knowing your worth, too. You've been looking for answers outside yourself, but the truth is, everything you need is inside you." The words hit the man harder than he expected. Everything you need is inside you. It was a truth he had spent his entire life running from, a truth he had buried beneath the weight of his failures and regrets. But now, for the first time, he was willing to believe it. "You're right," the man whispered, more to himself than to the boy. "I've spent so much time thinking I wasn't enough, but maybe I am. Maybe I can still be someone worthy of love." The boy smiled, a small, knowing smile that made the man's heart swell. "You just have to believe it, that's all. And then, you'll see." The encounter with the boy, though brief, was enough to reignite the spark of change within him. The man spent the following weeks in a state of painful growth. Every step was excruciating, every breakthrough felt fragile and uncertain, but he was determined. The road was long, and there were days when he wanted to give up, when the weight of his past threatened to pull him back into the darkness. But he pressed on. One afternoon, he returned to the place where he had last seen the woman, the one he had once loved. She wasn't there, but the absence of her presence didn't hurt as much as it used to. In fact, it was almost comforting, like the final chapter of a book he had closed long ago. As he stood there, staring at the empty street, he felt something shift within him, a deep, quiet peace that he hadn't known in years. He had come to terms with his mistakes, acknowledged the weight of his failures, and now, he was learning to forgive himself. The hurt that had once consumed him no longer had the power to control him. It was still there, of course, lingering in the background, but it no longer dictated his every action, every thought. In that moment, he realized that the boy had been right. It wasn't about fixing the past, it was about moving forward. It was about recognizing his worth, embracing his flaws, and learning to love himself in spite of everything. But there was still something missing, something he hadn't yet come to terms with. The man had spent so much of his life focusing on the people around him, on earning their love and approval, that he had forgotten one simple truth: he didn't need anyone else's validation. He had to validate himself first. The next few weeks were filled with small victories and moments of self-realization. He made peace with the fact that he might never fully repair the damage he had caused. The relationships he had broken might never be mended, and the pain he had inflicted might never be forgotten. But that was okay. What mattered now was that he was becoming someone new, a man who knew his worth, who no longer defined himself by his mistakes, and who was finally ready to embrace a future that was his to shape. And as he stood there in the stillness of the city, watching the people pass by, he understood something profound. Change didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with grand gestures or dramatic moments. It happened in the quiet, everyday choices. It happened in the small, steady steps forward. It happened when a man decided, once and for all, that he was ready to start over. He smiled to himself, a soft, genuine smile, and for the first time in a long time, he believed it. I am enough. And just like that, the boy's words came back to him: start with yourself. He had. And for the first time, he could say, with absolute certainty, that he was proud of the man he was becoming. And as we close this chapter of his journey, perhaps there's something in this story that resonates with you. Maybe you, too, have struggled with rejection, with pain, with the feeling that you're never enough. But I want to tell you something: you are enough. And just like the man in this story, you have the power to change, to heal, and to love yourself fully, without waiting for anyone else to tell you that you're worthy. If you've ever felt like you're not good enough or that no one will ever truly see you, there's a secret you need to know. Men, just like women, crave more than just surface-level attraction. There's a hidden key to unlocking their deepest desires, and it has nothing to do with looks or superficial gestures. It's something deeper, something more powerful. Want to learn what it is? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code to discover how you can learn this secret and transform your relationships. No matter where you are right now, you can turn your love life around and make anyone fall for you. Don't wait. The time is now. As the man stood there, feeling the weight of everything he had been through, a profound sense of clarity settled over him. His eyes gazed at the horizon, where the setting sun painted the sky with fiery hues of red and orange, a symbol of both the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Every step he had taken, every tear he had shed, every moment of doubt and pain, it had all led him to this singular, undeniable truth: he was no longer the man he once was. The man had been broken. He had been lost, drowning in the sea of his own regrets, hoping for something, anything, to pull him from the depths of despair. But now, he stood on solid ground, transformed, stronger than he had ever been. He had stared into the abyss, confronted the darkness within, and emerged not just unscathed, but reborn. And in this moment, there was a fire within him, an inferno of purpose that could no longer be extinguished. The man had come to understand that the true battle was never about others, it was about conquering himself, facing his fears, and owning his power. No longer shackled by his past, he felt an unstoppable surge of energy coursing through his veins. The world around him seemed to fall away, as if time itself had paused in reverence. And with the wind in his hair and the roar of possibility in his chest, he made a promise to himself. I will not be forgotten. I will not fade into the background of mediocrity. I will make the world see me, feel me, know me. I will rise, not just for myself, but for every single person who has ever believed that they weren't enough. For every soul that has been crushed under the weight of their own doubts. For every heart that has been broken, waiting for a savior. His words echoed in the stillness of the air, an oath to the universe itself, as if the very ground beneath his feet vibrated with the force of his resolve. No longer would he be the man who lived in the shadows of fear and regret. No longer would he be bound by the chains of insecurity. He would rise with an unshakable certainty, a man who had not only learned from his past but had turned it into the very fuel that would drive him to unimaginable heights. The man knew his journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And this time, he would walk into the unknown with his head held high, knowing that he was enough, not because of the world's validation, but because he had finally discovered the most powerful truth of all. He was a force to be reckoned with. As he took a step forward, the world seemed to shift. A quiet hum of energy filled the air. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to bring him to this moment, and there was no turning back. The road ahead was unclear, uncertain, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he no longer feared the darkness. No longer feared the unknown. For he had become the light that would guide him through any storm. And with that, he charged forward. Bold. Unyielding. Unstoppable. For the first time in his life, he was truly free. And nothing could ever take that away. The world is full of shadows, full of people who have lost their way, full of those who are still searching for that elusive key to unlock their true potential. But just like the man in this story, you can rise. You can break free. You can find that fire within you and let it burn brighter than you ever thought possible. If you feel like you've been wandering in the dark, unsure of who you are or what you're capable of, let this be the moment that changes everything. You have the power to rewrite your story, to reclaim your worth, and to make the world see you, not as you once were, but as the person you are meant to be. Are you ready to take that first step? To rise? To become the force you were always meant to be? Then don't wait. The time is now. Click the link, and let your journey begin. Because the world is waiting for you to step into your greatness. And once you do, there will be no stopping you.